Hey man, I helped thrust you into success on this project. I spent a week with you living in your basement.
Um, Time
Yeah,
start.
it
Okay,
was horrible
are we
going
good for recording those?
swimming every day. I know,
Um,
Matt. It's
well,
terrible.
I'll recording in 1, 2, 3.
Okay, welcome to this Automation Engineering Gathering. Please, if you're not intending to speak, mute your microphone. Thank you for being on time, and please note this gathering is being recorded and the video will be made available to watch later. So I'm Dave Hunt, an automation engineer working in the Firefox Product Integrity Test engineering group. I started these gatherings as a way to keep up with those projects and practices. The format's a monthly gathering with a guest to talk about a project they are working on or have worked on. This is the kind of event that I like to attend, so I started it primarily so that I could be an attendee. If you're interested, please join Integrity channel on IRC or the Automationeers channel on Slack. These may be used for sharing resources and can also be used for discussion and questions. I try to schedule these meetings every month. The times and dates vary depending on the guest's availability. Due to the all hands and holidays next month, we'll be skipping December's gathering, but look out for an invitation to January's event where we'll have Hamlet Villa sharing his work on a brand new tool for accessibility testing. If you're interested in being a guest in a future gathering or have any feedback or suggestions for guests, I'm keen to hear, so please send me an email. We are not likely, or we may not use up the full hour, and there will be time for questions. So if you've just joined us, I'd like to remind you to please mute your microphones unless you're intending on speaking, and note once more that this event is being recorded. So with all of that out of the way, I can finally introduce our guest. Chris Harches is known as the Grumpy Programmer online, though I must have always caught him on a good day. Let's hope today's one of those days. He's the author of several books on testing and PHP, and last year held his very own GrumpyConf. He can be found on Twitter as Grumpy Programmer. That's Grumpy without the U, and works remote from his fortress of Grumpitude in Ontario, Canada. So Chris, thank you for accepting my invitation, and over to you.
Thanks for the wonderful intro. Yeah, so Dave asked me to come and talk about some experiences I had trying to do some automation stuff with Android. So during the summer, Matt Brandt, when he and I were still working together as part of the old services team, we had the big reorg today, so I shed a tear that I won't be working with Matt that much anymore. But we wanted to do some exploration into the various tools that we had available to us to automate some tests involving Android devices that we were both doing manually. So as a test case, I had I do the test work for our push notification service. And one of the tests I need to do is verify that Vapid functionality works on Android devices. And that's a test I have been doing manually. And since I love to automate things, because why not make computers talk to other computers instead of humans making subtle mistakes talking to computers? We picked that as a test case. So Matt came to my house. We spent a week pair programming and working on stuff and swimming and barbecuing and all the fun things that you can do in the summer around where I live, with a goal of like trying to figure out, is there a path forward where we can take something that is manual towards something that is semi-automated, and then something that is semi-automated towards something that is fully automated. So we spent a lot of time kind of exploring what tooling we had available to us. My preference was to use PyTest because I do most of my work with Python to drive these tests. Then we had to look at, well, what are some of kind of the options we have for running Android devices? Did we want to use something like Sauce Labs? Could we use AWS Device Farm? Could we use Bitbar? Could we use Appium? There was kind of a whole bunch of approaches. So we spent a lot of time like trying to see how quickly could we get going with those, and at the same time evaluate tools with an eye towards how easy would it be to automate the final result. So after messing around with a lot of the tools, we found a good combination for building this prototype anyway, was we could use PyTest on our local environment. In this case, I'm running on a Mac. And that we could use the Android device emulation that's available if you install Android Studio. So in the end, we got a prototype working, but when I show you the prototype, you'll see some of kind of the problems we ran into as we were trying to figure out, can we move this thing towards total automation? So the first thing we had to do was get Android Studio installed, and that's, you just go to the website and click the installer, and then we use the emulator. So I'm going to I'm going to share my screen now and guide you through how we can go from having those tools installed to running an automated test. So I'm just going to switch to sharing my screen now, and I hope my bandwidth that I have out here in rural Ontario supports my upstream. So just give me a second here, and I'm going to shut off my camera and then share my screen. Okay, I don't know if the screen has come up yet because I know there's always a bit of a lag. So basically the idea with this test was I only wanted to have 2 things open at any one time. This is a pet peeve of mine, having too many things open in order to run a test. In a perfect world, all I have is my terminal window, which hopefully you can see now, and over here, which I've clicked on to bring up, is the virtual devices that I'm using. So for this particular test, I picked a Pixel device. So if we're starting off from scratch, we use the virtual device, use Android Studio to grab whatever device you wish to emulate. So I start off by just activating the device. It's a Pixel API 22. I just wanted a somewhat modern device that I knew would run Firefox nightly. So while that's loading, I'm going to talk about what we also had to do. Matt and I had a fun adventure of trying to figure out where could we get an APK file of Firefox nightly that supports Marionette, because that was the technology that we thought would kind of be the easiest for us to figure out how to use. So Marionette turned out to be the key to making this test as easy as possible to write. So we ended up having to do some fun stuff with looking in Tree Herder for specific builds, and it was very interesting to try to figure out Tree Herder if you've never used it before, where you need to click. There was a bunch of drill downs I had to go into, but eventually we found an APK file. So the process is this. I like to start off with an emulated device with no user data on it. So that's kind of what I have here. Then you need to make sure you have the command line tools from the Android SDK installed on your local system. In this case, I've done a symlink to ADB, which is just a command line tool that you can use to manipulate things on the emulated device. Oops, it's ADB, sorry. Yep, so it's there. And I'm just going to move this over so you can see it a little bit better. So there's 2 things that I had to do in order to get the Android device ready for running the test. The first is I had to use it to install the APK file. So documentation for ADB is pretty good. It just basically said, ADB install along with the path to the APK that you want to install. So you should get a message that's kind of similar to this. It will show some sort of progress update saying it's found the APK, installing it, how big it might be, some sort of transfer rate for local, and it should say success. So if that's the case, I always go over and verify on my device that Firefox Nightly, because we picked an older version of Nightly. If I click here, yep, I can see that Firefox Nightly is there. So I'm just going to click on it in the device to open it up, and we should have a blank Firefox window. Then the next thing you need to do in order for the test to work, you have to do some port forwarding using ADB to tell it I want local port 2828, which is what our Marionette test is using, redirects to port 2828 on this device. So I use this other ADB command that just simply forwards the port for us. So you run this command, it sets it up. And so with having done this, we now have our environment ready to run the test. So I'm going to show you the test that we wrote. It's very simple. Vim is complaining. So basically what we decided to do was, there's a page that J.R. Conlon, who works on the team that develops the push server, created for testing things on Vapid. Vapid functionality works. And what happens is this page, if you load this page, it will go in the background and execute a bunch of commands that are via JavaScript that are relevant to Vapid, and will check off a whole bunch of things, and then it will redirect you to a success page if the test is passed. So previously, Matt and I had worked on a prototype where we were looking for individual elements in the DOM on this page, and after I had a brief conversation with Nojun Park about kind of our approach, he said, well, it probably would be easier and more reliable if we could get that test page updated so that if all the tests pass, it goes to a success page, and if any of the tests fail, it goes to a failure page, and then we investigate further with the failure. Only do this testing, I had access to 2 different Android devices that I have here at home, one configured to point to the stage auto push server, and the other configured to make sure it's pointing to production. So we could always go back and look. So the test is kind of simple. We create a Marionette client telling it we want to use port 2828. We start the session, go to this, navigate to this URL. I needed to do a sleep because it takes some time for that page to load and execute all the JavaScript commands behind the scene to verify Vapid functionality. And then I do an assertion that the URL, the expected URL, is inside the URL we get back from the client. The actual URL is much, much longer. It excuse me, it contains a bunch of optional parameters in the result that you can use to debug to try to figure out what type of device loaded the page. So like I said, this test it's a simple one and it's very straightforward, and it basically emulates what I was doing manually, where I would load that page and wait for it to load and see if I got the results that I wanted. So what we discovered quite quickly was the first problem that we had was that there is no easy way that Matt and I could find to click on, to like automate the clicking of you acknowledging that the browser is supposed to accept notifications. So if I run the test, you'll see over here, as I'm now highlighting the emulator, the test will fail the first time because it's waiting for me to click on what is being generated out of the browser Chrome instead of something that's inside the DOM. So I'm going to run the test and you can kind of see what happens here. Well, hopefully it should work. I tested it earlier. What's it waiting for? No, that's not it. All right, let me try killing the test and run it again. Of course, this is always the case with a live demo. Never works the way that you want it to. All right, I need to debug something here. It should be working. I forwarded the correct port. And this thing is running. Let me make sure I can load things. Yeah, that works. Oh, of course. You need to click on this always. So you get this big debugging output from PyTest via Marionette, where the test fails, and not because the Vapid functionality didn't work. It's just because we couldn't figure out how to get it to click on the always. So you can run this, and it said, yeah, everything passed. So I'm just going to run it again so you can see that the test will actually pass. And one more time. so you can see up at the top. It does the sleep. So one little test, it verifies that if we load the initial page, we get redirected to this page. So I'm going to now stop screen sharing and put my camera back on. So the outcome of kind of this exploration was that we felt that we definitely had like some base options available to us. It sure seemed like using Marionette and connecting to an Android device somewhere, it could be local, could be remote, was definitely viable. Just the obstacle that we faced was there was currently no easy way with Marionette to get it to introspect into the Chrome and look for that notification from the browser itself, so that every time we run the test, if it gets a notification, click on accept. So that's kind of what I wanted to demo. So happy to answer questions or take suggestions from folks on approaches that we can use to kind of build on what we did here.
I'm curious if there are any like accessibility hooks, because usually when there are notifications, it's gonna like let a user know somehow that there's a notification, that the notification goes away, and there might be something like that you can maybe look for or check for, because like a screen reader user would have to know that that's popping up, and yeah, you might be able to use something like that to interact with that.
Yeah, that's one which had actually never occurred to me, because I have seen other folks who are using accessibility features of browsers to do some interesting things with tests to try and solve this exact problem where we have a visual cue and the system is waiting. Yeah, if a screen reader can detect that there's a notification and somehow allow the user to acknowledge it, then excuse me, that definitely seems like a way to turn this test from where it's kind of semi-automated with user intervention.
Just straight Marionette. Like we want to pick a tool, a framework, without kind of going too hacky or outside the bounds of that tool. And that I don't think was a feature available. And it's worth reviewing it now, right? Fast forward 6 months. How many months? No, it was long. I don't remember. I broke my leg, but but it,
Service, you know, a little node app that runs that I can test desktop notifications. I'm sure I could probably end up doing something similar with several other parts of the testing. But the goal is always to move things along that path towards getting to a point where some sort of CI system can execute these tests without a human observing them, because that's kind of the goal.
And from the web compat and interoperability work that Kimberly and I are going to be doing in 2019, mobile is still a big focus of ours. So absolutely, I mean, tongue-in-cheek, I'm saying I don't think we're going to work week, but our paths will cross in terms of what we're trying to accomplish in terms of automation. So,
other questions or comments?
Yeah, Chris, I was just curious, were there other approaches that you tried and were unsuitable? You mentioned Appium, for example. Is that something you spent any time looking into, or was it focused directly on the Marionette from the start?
It definitely was not focused on Marionette from the start. The first tool I looked at was AWS Device Farm, and then we quickly discovered, since you're limited to using their kind of viewer interface, which is inside a browser, that was just, there was no way that, given we only had a couple of days to come up with a prototype, that approach was going to work. So that seemed not to be suitable. We looked at Bitbar. Bitbar seemed like it could host those, excuse me, it could host the devices for us, but Matt can correct me if I'm wrong, but I remember seeing that some of the libraries that we had to use were ones I wasn't familiar with. I had done a little bit of Marionette, so Marionette was kind of, I had a point of reference that I believe that it could solve this problem if we could get a emulated device somewhere. So Bitbar is potentially an option. I would imagine something like Sauce Labs hosting devices. If Sauce Labs does device hosting and we can access it kind of the same way through a forwarded TCP port, then we don't need to use the emulator locally. So
I can answer some of those two pieces. So back to Bitbar, yes, we did look at it Chris and I were sitting in an office together for a week, and we basically mapped out potential directions, and then we each split off and did some investigative work. And so, we looked at Bitbar, and programmatically, I can't remember where we hit a block, but it actually involved reaching out to the professional services team, and they're like, "Oh, we hadn't thought about that use case. We could code something up for you, but it didn't." In terms of working with Firefox, working with notifications, etc., wasn't supported by them. Same thing with Sauce Labs. That was another spike that I did. That Sauce Labs, while it looked like a potential, it wasn't something that was they could provide out of the box for us at that time.
Yeah, the biggest stumbling block seems to be the ability to have Marionette-enabled builds where Marionette is already turned on, and the ability to have the browser in a state where it's already able to accept notifications. Those are like the two biggest obstacles. Once those are solved, then further testing involving doing stuff like this becomes way simpler. But those are two pretty big obstacles where, unfortunately, the test still requires a human to intervene and click on a few buttons.
Is the test as it is currently being used in that way, or is it sort of being held until we have unblocked those limitations?
Well, I mean, I am still doing it manually for now with the devices. Next time I do a deployment, I could definitely use this, but it kind of seems to me that until we can get over that particular block, there's no point in me investing further time in doing this work, because this test works. It just needs to have the parts that I'm manually doing on the emulator replaced with an automated thing. And once that's done, then we can work on the next step, which is, okay, how do I move this test being semi-automated out of my own environment up into a CI system somewhere that's triggered when a build of the push service works. So it's like, I could keep doing this, but I don't see the point until I'm able to to automate the things that I've been doing manually. Is kind of how I look at it. I mean, is it annoying that I have to use a physical device? Yes, it absolutely is. But that is currently the best solution with the same obstacles that are in place. At least I know with the device that's with the version of Android that I'm using on the actual physical hardware, I don't have to go in and enable Marionette because I'm manually loading the page, and I just click on accepting the notification and everything is fine. So we're kind of at an impasse where we're kind of at like a technological blocker where something needs to change in the tooling to turn this thing into a fully automated test.
So one approach that I think is a possibility is to combine a number of different tools. So if you had some level of automation on the application level, so something like Appium, or there are other options for Android, you could initially kick off your test controlling the application, maybe even using the UI to go to about config and flip that Marionette preference. Then separately use Marionette to start your test, and then potentially sort of switch back to the application level automation and accept that notification if it's present. But yeah, I don't know if there is the one tool that would do both. Well, I guess controlling on the application level might do it, especially if you're essentially looking at the URL, which is part of the application UI, rather than necessarily looking at the contents of the test success page. But yeah, that would be maybe one approach to try. There may be other solutions. Maybe there's other ways in which we can set that notification to initially be sort of pre-approved.
Yeah, I mean, I like Marionette, but if there's a better option. I mean, I think, especially after discussing it with Node-Gen, it sure seemed like switching to a case where we're just needing to make sure that we've been redirected to the URL that we're expecting to be at. That opens us up to try and evaluate different things. But like I said, the big obstacle basically seems to be flipping the bit to get it listening for Marionette, and also the big piece that I don't even know if any of the current tools we're using will detect that notification and accept it. Maybe we have some tests that are doing that already. The last time I asked somebody about this, I heard that it was in progress but hadn't been finalized, or it was flaky and not stable, something like that. But once we have an internal tool, once we have a tool available to us that can detect when Firefox is waiting for someone to click on that notification button, then I'm happy to spend some time rewriting this test to use that tool, because that will definitely get us further along to me not having to be present whenever we do these, when the push server gets deployed, that we'll have an automated suite of tests that will just run everything, and we'll know when something busted instead of me babysitting all these test runs, which I do not enjoy doing.
It's really cool, guys. Another tool you could consider, I know we use on the Android test team, is using something like UI Automator. And then if you use the tools that team's using, you'd also have access to Firebase, which could probably be integrated with the Jenkins system you have. I'm not sure if we can detect push notifications using UI Automator or not. I have to look into that, but that would be another option. And then the tools would be standard with what the Android team is using. And basically the workflow that you've worked out, it's not work wasted. It's just using a different framework and, taking a different approach, and where you ran it, it could be Dockerized, whatever, passed around from team to team. Because obviously the work you guys do here is going to be valuable to the Android test team as well.
So I have a question, less about the test itself and more about your experience in the work week. So I understand it was the two of you for a few days. How did you approach your use of time? And because you only had 2 or 3 days, I'm guessing, to come up with a solution. So yeah, I'm just curious to get some insight into how that went.
So, so the first thing was when I was talking about how I wanted to explore some of these things, and I just needed some, I felt like I needed some dedicated time to do it, because trying to work on this stuff in between doing everything else, I felt like it would be a constant start and stop idea. So I was like, okay, I want to be able to set aside a block of time, ideally a week, to like explore these things where put everything else on hold and really dig deep and focus. And then when Matt was like, well, he's kind of doing something, he needs to do things similar to that. So we're like, okay, so we have a natural synergy between where we have at least two people who need to do some research into these tools and look for solutions. So once we agreed on that the two of us were going to do a work week, then leading into it, it was like, okay, so what do we want to have accomplished by the end of the work week? So we said, okay, well, I think like a working prototype that we can share is the goal. That we figured Matt flew in on a Monday, so they gave us Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, like 4 days to work on stuff. So we figured 4 days was enough, that unless we've done something horribly wrong, we should have a working prototype to share. So once we knew we wanted to have a working prototype, then we could determine like a scope, what were we going to do? Then it's like, okay, well, we need to investigate. We have a bunch of options. We can look into using Marionette. We can look at APM. We can look at whether Device Farm works, BitBar, Sauce Labs. We already kind of knew ahead of time what technologies were out there for us to evaluate, and we just kind of needed to like say, I'm going to go look in how can we use a local emulator, and Matt's going to go look at BitBar, and I'm going to look at AWS Device Farm, and he's going to look at Sauce Labs, so that we could slowly start like eliminating options based on what we were trying to accomplish. That tool wasn't sufficient for what we were going to do. So once we had figured out these are the tools we're going to look at, here's the outcome, then we looked at that scope and did like a thumbs up or thumbs down. Do we think that we have enough time to do enough research and then prototyping to come up with something? And we looked at it and said, yes, we believe we have enough time. And then Matt came, we divided up the work, we did all the research, we pair programmed back and forth, brainstormed solutions, hit up people within Mozilla who had access to resources that we needed in order to solve to get past any stoppers and obstacles. And I think it worked really well. I would definitely recommend that sort of setup, 2 to 3 days of focused work, where you just put everything else off to the side, define that scope very carefully of what you're trying to accomplish. Because if it had been totally open-ended, I don't think Matt and I would have gotten anything concrete done. Since we're friends, it would have been too easy just to screw around for 4 days rather than actually come up with something at the end that's valuable that we could also build on going forward. We could take that, say we're at this state and we kind of know where we need to go, so we just have to wait until there's other solutions available to us to get us to that next hurdle. Hope that answers your question.
It does. Thank you.
I think the big thing for me, Dave, and group, is that we did a lot of pre-work ahead. So it's not like we said, hey, this seems like a good idea. We have intersection points. Let's do the work week, and then waited till then. We made sure our environments were set up, so we both had working dev environments. We really mapped out in a shared document some of the directions that we thought might pay off versus the areas that we have explored that were like, this is going to be a dead end for X, Y, X, Y, Z. Helps being in a town that doesn't have a stoplight. Like, there actually wasn't a lot to do in his town to screw around, by the way. He doesn't even have a stoplight in his town. He's got a Timmy's. But yeah, doing a lot of the pre-work ahead was really important. And I think that actually was the key for me that made that particular work week really successful, is that we spent a lot of time ahead, like probably a couple of months ahead of it, just slowly picking apart like exactly what we thought might and might not work, building out those relationships. So we built out the relationship with Joel's team, working with BitBar, spent some time with Nojun, trying to understand what was available to us and what we wanted to go towards. So some of the work like Nojun was doing is interesting, but it's not in Python. right? And so that immediately cut it off because it doesn't fit in with the workflow and knowledge of our team, previous team, I guess, but still the current teams. So that, like we picked the things that were important to us and made it clear to one another, so that it wasn't just one person making a decision. I think bouncing off of ideas off of each other was really valuable. And so again, that pre-work ahead, I think, is what it made it really successful, so that we could just show up and get going, and we knew what we wanted to deliver on and what we felt was like reasonable and responsible to deliver on by the end of the week, and so we could push towards it. Now, it wasn't so like specific that we're like, we're going to be a complete failure if we don't exactly hit this thing that just works and that we're going to like shift the production. That wasn't the goal of the work week, right? This was trying to solve a problem that was difficult for us and to one, articulate and understand, but also it was unique to what any one specific group was trying to do or accomplish. So I don't know. I found it highly useful. I highly recommend the style of work week. They're very exhausting. I don't want to see Chris for another 6 months. Well, until the end of the month, anyways, December. I'm ready to see him again. But like realistically, right? It has to be a very special occasion, and you have to want to solve a special problem and get the right people in the room to do that. So I don't know. I wouldn't want to do this from an office. I think there'd be too many distractions, especially if you know other people. Unless you need those people to be included in on the conversation. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Does anybody else have any other questions? Okay, in that case, thank you, Chris. That was excellent. Like I said earlier, we're going to be skipping December's gathering, so at some point soon, I'll send out an invitation for January's. If you do have any feedback or suggestions for Chris, please let him know. And if you have any suggestions or feedback on this gathering, or ideas for who could be future guests or projects, I'd be happy to receive any of that. So until next time, take care, and thanks again, Chris.
Chris, thanks, Dave. Thanks, Matt.
Yeah.